My name is Nancy Abbey, and I'd like to welcome you here this evening on behalf of the People's Democratic Club. We are very pleased to sponsor this forum because as progressive Democrats, we feel that campaign finance is one of the most important issues facing us right now in politics. The amount of money that's being spent, the amount of money that's been unleashed by the Supreme Court, the undue influence of money in politics by billionaires and by corporations is something that we've got to look at and resolve. We have to do it on the national level, the state level, and the local level. We're going to start off this evening with an overview of what's happening in campaign reform legislation. And then we're going to have some really interesting and interactive map that shows you where different campaigns are happening, where different reforms are happening around the country. And a couple of our UCSC interns have put together a really beautiful and interesting map for you to look at. And then we'll look at the trends in local campaign contributions and expenditures, so that we have a better understanding of what's happening right here. And then a proposal by Micah Posner for campaign spending limits and for campaign financing by the city. After that, we'll take some statements, which I think is a really funny way to say this. You know how people always get up with a question that goes on and on and on and they tell you their viewpoint? Well, we're saying we have time for statements and questions. And we will be taking the questions on cards, which will be distributed to you later. My t-shirt says, "Sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul." So take that to heart. You have to do something about things you care about. So let's start off with Bruce Van Allen.
Thank you, Nancy. I want to do a couple things here to kind of give an overview. And first of all, Senator Bill Monning is a big supporter of campaign finance reform, and he couldn't make it. We hoped originally that he was going to be on our program with us tonight, but he's got a grandchild with a birthday today, and then he has to drive to Sacramento tonight, so couldn't get it in. But he sends his greetings and urges us with the reminder that the way most reforms happen and real change happens is from the ground up, and that is, it's about organizing and it's about people working collectively together. So that's Bill's reminder to us about what we're up to tonight. I want to give a little overview of what the Congress and the California legislature are doing. From my own perspective, it may not be good enough, it may not be enough, but at least somebody in each of those bodies is working on some reforms. So first of all, right now in Congress, there is a bill called H.R. 20, House Bill 20, which is co-sponsored by our representative, Sam Farr. And what it does is a few things. It allows for a tax checkoff of up to $25 a person that will go towards public financing of campaigns. So that's a voluntary thing that you can do when you file your taxes. And then it sets up a system where if a candidate agrees to some limitations, then they can qualify for the public financing that is established by both that checkoff and also by the legislation that involves closing some corporate loopholes, which seems very appropriate to me, to help pay for it. So H.R. 20 in Congress right now is in consideration. It's in a committee, and if you would like to support that, Sam Farr is a good conduit for hearing from us and then passing that on to the rest of Congress. In the state Senate, there are 3 bills right now under consideration, and I had to put some notes together on these. The first one is Senate Bill 27, which is known as the Political Reform Act of 2014. And what it does is it requires, there's a special kind of nonprofit organization you might have heard of, a 501c4, which is not the same as the nonprofits that run social services and so on, but it's a corporation that is expressly set up to be able to do political work. And unfortunately, it's become a way for political donors to hide the source, or political organizations to hide the sources of their funding. And so California Senate Bill 27 daylights that. It requires the disclosure of the significant donors to all 501c4s. And that would get us out of some of the subterfuge that happened that you might remember in the last election in particular that was just outrageous. That was hidden under a 501c4. Secondly, Senate Bill 52 is the California Disclosure Act. And this requires further reform that we already have a little bit of now, or have had a little bit of now, that requires campaigns for those things have to disclose their largest sources of funding. If there is an ad that's something like Californians for Better Government or something like that, that can't be enough, that can't be allowed to be the only information that's revealed, but rather the major donors behind that sham organization really have to be revealed and reported. And it has to be online so that people can find it out in a short time from when the money comes in. And then finally, California Senate Bill 1253, which is coming up for hearing soon. Is that my phone? No. Which is known as the Ballot Measure Transparency Act. It's going to require that the voters have access, again, from the Secretary of State and online, for information about who is behind ballot measures. That is, if a group starts to circulate petitions or gets a ballot measure qualified for the ballot, this act will require that the actual proponents of that ballot measure be disclosed. Again, that's in the California Senate, Senate Bill 27, Senate Bill 52, and Senate Bill 1253. And Bill Monning would love to hear from you about this. If they pass in the Senate and go over to the Assembly, I'm sure that Mark Stone and Luis Alejo will also be interested, and I expect them to be supportive. Finally, in the California legislature, there's a very interesting thing happening now in the Assembly, which is known as Assembly Joint Resolution 1. And what it is it's an invocation of a fairly obscure provision of the U.S. Constitution, which allows for the states to call on Congress to convene a constitutional convention. And the idea would be to convene a convention with the subject specified of campaign finance reform, for example, to overthrow the Citizens United decision and the recent McCutcheon decision. And the point of this is that a lot of people don't believe Congress is going to act. And the usual way that constitutional amendments happen is we wait for Congress. Well, if the states take initiative, the Congress can be required to act and call the Constitutional Convention. So that's Assembly Joint Resolution 1. And again, to me, we have to take all this into account, that these are things happening at the state and national level, and they're subject to all the usual kinds of lobbying and myriad political forces that affect the Congress and the state legislature. So write to your representatives. The next part of our program is we're going to have two presentations from some student interns that have been doing some incredible research and work with us. And we're going to try to kind of focus in a few steps down to the local level. And so the first thing is a look at where some of the most important reform has been coming from in California, in campaign finance, that is at cities and a couple states around the country. So let me introduce Elise Zarye and Justin Burke, who will present this information.
First of all, I'd like to thank Common Cause, because that's basically where we got all of our information. So basically, the proposed initiative that we're talking about today isn't a new idea at all. There's a movement building across the country, and it's spreading throughout the United States. And as you can see from this map, in pink, the states are highlighted in pink. Those are areas of proposed reform. They haven't passed yet. There's no programs there in place right now, but they're attempting to pass them. Blue is where they actually have passed. They have programs for campaign finance. And then as you can see from the dots, those are cities that have passed campaign finance at the local level. So, first of all, so we're here to talk about money in politics. So why is that such an important issue? Well, because we have way too much money in it. Corporations are not people, unions are not people, so we have to get money out of politics. So first of all, I'm going to talk about New York, which I'm going to say is the flagship of this movement, you could say. So Elise?
In New York, there are public funds to match contributions. Only candidates participating in the campaign finance program and that are respecting the limits are eligible to receive public funds. Contribution from political committees can only be accepted if the committees are registered with the Campaign Finance Board. All candidates are permitted to receive contribution from corporations, LLCs, LLPs, and partnerships.
Okay, and then if we look a little closer to home, San Francisco also provides public funded matches, or public match funds, and same thing, no corporations, local, national, foreign, can contribute. So, and then those are big cities. So we can't necessarily duplicate that, or if we do, it's going to look a little differently. So if we look at Ventura.
So in Ventura, the Campaign Finance Ordinance mandate that all candidate control committee and independent expenditure committees raising or expended at least $10,000 file campaign statement electronically with county clerk election division, so we can have some kind of track of the contribution, and candidates who accepted the voluntary expenditure limit can spend more than the expenditures, of course.
Okay, so essentially, I mean, it's gonna look different in every city. It's not gonna be the exact same model. There's no necessarily perfect model for this, but the point is that you have incentives to follow these voluntary limits. You go by these voluntary limits and you get public funding because of that, and that's your major incentive. Obviously, we can't make it mandatory because of Citizens United, but if you push this, especially with enough support from voters, it can work. So, kind of, I guess, in conclusion, I would say money is not speech.
Yeah.
You know, obviously, every candidate needs money to run a campaign. I mean, you need money, but everyone should have equal access to the same amount of money, and it shouldn't be, you know, you shouldn't be focusing on fundraising instead of polishing your ideas and polishing your positions, and, you know, actually reaching out to voters and seeing what they need and what they want, instead of, oh, I need to raise more money from this large donor or whatever. And then, I mean, at the national or at the state and national level, they become powerless to corporations and large donors because they get so much money from them, and then they have to return the favor. So, you know, this has to stop. We have to fight for our government and for our democracy. So I'm just going to leave you with this quote from Abraham Lincoln. Elections belong to the people. It's their decision. If they decide to turn their backs on the fire and burn their behinds, then they just have to sit on their blisters. So.
For the next thing, Justin and Elise did, and a third student, Margaret Esguerra, did some research on the history in Santa Cruz of campaign contributions and expenditures. And there are some gaps in our information, but what we found was some very interesting things that they're going to illustrate for you about how that relates to number of votes received and some other things like that. And again, trying to get focused down here to the local level.
So Elise is going to do the main work on this, but I'll introduce it. So essentially we went through the city clerk's office, and first of all, actually, I'd like to thank the city clerk for letting us go through all those records. And some of them we did manually, and then some of them we looked through electronically. But yeah, so like Bruce said, we're missing a lot of information, especially in the earlier years, so we limited this to 2004 to 2012. We thought we had data back to 1996, but we just didn't have enough to actually run regressions and make good data out of it. So, Elise.
Hello, everybody. I would like to start off by general tendency we observed from 2004 to 2012. So we tried to compile the average expenditure made by winners, candidate that won, and by candidate that lost, and then the total average. And we see that there's a tendency of increasing disparity between the money that the candidates that won spent and the candidate that lost spent, especially in 2012. We have a graph to show you visually. And here you can see that the difference between the expenditure is increasing. The year 2008 is a little bit special, first because it was a presidential elections, and in presidential elections, voters tend to vote more since they have to go vote anyway. And also, we had the financial crisis this year, so the expenditure didn't follow the pattern we found. And then we tried to look a little bit closer and compare the number of votes received with the expenditure. And we also integrated the gender, assuming that men have more chances to be elected, and incumbency, if the candidate was already at city council. So we did a first one, a first regression, and we found that we translated an average number of votes per dollar. So if I'm a candidate and I spend $1, this is how many votes I will get in average. And you can see that the year 2008, right here, is really high, since candidates didn't have to raise as much money to get people to vote. But you see that in 2012, it's getting down. So it means that candidates have to raise more and more money to, spend more and more money to get more votes, which is kind of alarming. Let's see that another way. In the next regression I did, I translated it in how much is a vote. And your votes in 2012 costed $4.76. That's the price of a vote. And it was down in 2008. And you see that it's increasing, and it's scary because a vote shouldn't correspond to an amount of money. This is not how politics is supposed to work. Even though I talk about factors like inflation that are not to be disregarded, but why do I think it's important to show that is, as a city, we don't face corruption too much, but as a state, we really do. And I found on Compose an article about the oil lobbying and their contribution to the state elections of California. They increased by 400% at the last election, which means that in the last 15 years, big oil has spent $143.3 million on political candidates and campaign. And first of all, it's more than any other corporation, because corporations are already donating a lot of money to candidates at a state level. And how do we prevent that? Well, we create a grassroots movement like right now. We try to change it at a city level, and we try to make the state government aware that it's not okay anymore and we really need a reform.
Our own city council member, Micah Posner, has a proposal that he's been talking about for a few months. He's managed to get Don Lane, also on the city council, to join him as a co-sponsor. And I'd like to invite Micah up to present his proposal for campaign finance reform in Santa Cruz.
All right, well, the first way we make change is we get younger people and people who aren't part of the political machine involved. So I'm already inspired by the last two speakers. I hope you guys were as well. That was some thoughtful and caring interactions going on there. And those are the kind of people that helped me get elected. Those young people that came out and knocked on doors. And so that's where I came from. I didn't know that much about money and politics or whatever until I started to run for office. And I found a system that to me could be a lot more obvious and clean and clear. And you know, when I was running for office and also when I was studying the past elections, I didn't see outright corruption in Santa Cruz. I mean, let me just say straight up, and I really appreciate about this, in our culture in Santa Cruz, every candidate for the last 20 or 30 years, 20 years anyways, has accepted an individual limit of $325, well, it's moved a little bit, but about $325 per person, an organizational limit of $780 per person. And that's why that data wasn't worse than it could be, because we've had a relatively polite culture. those limits are part of what's called a voluntary expenditure limit. There were these individual limits that rose with inflation, and there was also an overall expenditure limit. And for many, many years, for 5 or 6 election cycles, everyone agreed to both. And then in 2004, some of the candidates started to go over the overall expenditure limit. Now, they still agreed to the individual limit, which is the real sort of safeguard against corruption, but they started to go over the overall expenditure limit. And after that, as you saw with the graph, things started to get a little nutty and people started to spend more and more money. So that now some of the women candidates have spent $43,000 or $44,000, $45,000, and the limit, which has risen with inflation, is $27,000. So why is this a problem? Because like I said, I don't view it as corruption per se, but there's several problems with people spending more and more and more money in Santa Cruz politics. One problem is that people are no longer agreeing to the voluntary ordinance. So even though they're having a polite culture, they're not agreeing to the ground rules. What that tells me is, in 2 years or 4 years or 8 years, someone could accept $10,000 from, a developer over the hill or whoever, or $50,000 or $100,000, because once we stopped agreeing to the ordinance, then, it's just a matter of politeness, and kind of the rules of play are now gone, right? So that makes me really concerned. And part of my proposal is simply to make those limits mandatory. It is legal to make the limits per individual and organization mandatory. In fact, they are mandatory in the county. So when my proposal comes to council on June 10th in the evening, it will be divided up, and the council might decide to do some things and other things. So one part of it, 7 o'clock, June 10th in the evening. One part of it will, the council agenda moves around a little bit, but that's when the staff are planning for it, when the mayor's planning for it. So one part of it will be simply to make those limits mandatory. But I also think that there's no reason why we should have to accept escalating costs of elections. To me, it seems that we could have a fair, level playing field and everyone could have the same maximum. Both Don Lane and I agreed to the voluntary expenditure limits. We both raised, a few bucks less than the overall limit, which was $26,000 at the time. And we both won. He won first place and I won third place. So it's perfectly possible to win an election while obeying the limits. But the disadvantage of having more and more money involved, there's several disadvantages. One is that it really prioritizes people who have ties to money or who are better fundraisers. So I'm a good fundraiser. I could have raised more money because I've been raising money for people for many years. I chose not to because I want to obey the limits. But if there are no limits, then you're more likely to get council members who are better fundraisers or who have more ties to people with money, than other types of council members. And to me, democracy is about eliminating class barriers and looking for the best candidate, right? The other problem is that if we prioritize fundraising more, and when I say best candidate, before I move on to the subject, let me identify some groups that really should be represented on city council in Santa Cruz and usually aren't, and it's partially because of the fundraising. So we don't have very many students on city council, including grad students. We don't have very many Latinos on city council, even though we have a huge Latino population. And we don't have very many other minorities. There's never been an African American on city council. We have a problem in that it's mostly white, middle class, retired people who get on city council. And I have a personal admission to make. I was having a really hard time. I wanted to run for city council, and I was having a hard time doing it. And then my mommy, who is a middle class white, person with a pension, she offered to help take care of the kids or even help with rent while I ran for office, because how do you run for office if you're not relatively wealthy, because you can't work for 3 months, right? So this is a real problem, and my proposal is a partial solution. The other reason not to let the cost keep going up is that it's just a waste of money. I mean, at $26,000, I did 2 mailers. I had as much printing as I needed for people to distribute. I kept a campaign manager in rent and food. I mean, not that she got paid super well, but I paid a campaign manager. So as you start to raise more and more money, what you get is more pieces of paper at your door. There are some of the candidates, I went around to the same doors. I dropped 1 piece of paper, they dropped 4. You get more and more of the same. You get bigger, glossier mailers. You get, because you can't buy TV in Santa Cruz anyways because the television sphere is too wide, doesn't make any sense. So you're essentially just spending more and more money on something that is arguably useless and is certainly a waste of money for our whole society. So those are the reasons why I think that in addition to making the limits mandatory, we should strongly encourage candidates to agree to an overall expenditure limit. The last reason is that we're Santa Cruz, right? We want to set a good example. I mean, feminism has had huge strides here, environmentalism has huge strides here. This is one of the biggest issues of our time in our country. We all know that. Judge Stevens recently said that in a new book he put out, retired Judge Stevens. And there's 60 cities across the country that are setting an example and taking leadership in this. There's a state, there's a bill in the US Congress. I think Santa Cruz should be at the cutting edge, not because we have such a bad problem, but because we want to be an example for the rest of the country. And I know people have been referring this as my proposal, which is not true. As you saw, there's 60 cities around the country that are doing this, and Sam Farr has a model in the House of Representatives. This is our best practice right now. Is it perfect? No way. I mean, there's going to be problems. There's going to be, in fact, some of my proposal, some of the proposal when it goes to council is going to have some cleanup language from the old ordinance because it's a little bit confusing in some parts what counts as an expenditure or whatever. So I worked on that with the city clerk. So it's not perfect by any way, shape, or means, but as you can see from the map, it is our best practice, and so I think we should institute it right away. One problem, let me just say straight up loud, because people are saying, they're critiquing this, they're saying, well, there can still be independent expenditures. That's true. We can't use a mechanism of partial public financing to control independent expenditures. So the corporations will still give money to candidates. They traditionally do that through a group called, or the businesses, not all corporations, but locally owned business association, LOBA, which kind of gathers business money and gives money to city council candidates. And then the unions often, they don't give money to city council candidates, it's not legal, but they spend money. And it's a little bit awkward because you can't communicate to a candidate. So it's not the same as a candidate controlling their money, it's not as effective, but it does happen. So LOBA usually does mailers and door hangers, and the unions often do that. And luckily in Santa Cruz, they tend to spend some amounts of money. I think maybe the union looks at LOBA and spends a little bit less money or something, but there's a bit of a balance going on, which is just sort of, I kind of appreciate the unions for it myself personally, but that's my own perspective. But anyways, we can't stop that because of the Citizens United campaign. The only way we can stop that is by getting involved with these federal and state efforts, federal efforts really. So this is an incremental proposal, I know that straight up. It doesn't solve the whole problem, but I think it's a step in the right direction. So the actual language has been drafted by the city attorney, it's in the back, it's legal, and I really appreciate the staff's work on this to check it out, make sure it's legal. So it would take the current voluntary expenditure ordinance, which is, it rises with the cost with inflation and with the amount of voters. It's a relatively complicated formula. At the moment, per person is $325, per organization is $780, and the total limit is $26,641. And the goals of the ordinance are to minimize potentially corrupting influence, and also the appearance of corruption. Because if we have a clear playing field and clear rules, then everyone knows that it's not corrupt, even if which is different from having sort of a polite culture and having it not be corrupt. It's clear to everyone that Santa Cruz is taking control of this issue. To limit overall expenditures in campaigns, which will allow, I'm reading the link from the current voluntary expenditure limit, thereby allowing candidates to spend less time fundraising and more time communicating with voters and working on issues. And that was true for me. One of the other people that ran when I ran, she raised $43,000, and I held 22 house neighborhood meetings. I mean, she also had a good ground campaign. That's partly how she won. She knocked on doors, and her friends did too. But from talking to her later, she held fundraising events that I didn't, and I went to 22 neighborhood parties and communicate with voters. So if we have limits on expenditures, that's the kind of thing we're going to be able to encourage. So the way this ordinance would change is that for every dollar you raise as a candidate, you'll get $1 from the city. But my proposal is to do it at $5,000 increments, because what I don't want is 30 candidates running who are all getting public money who haven't raised any money. Because the fact is, and it's an unpleasant fact, but the fact is you have to be able to raise some money to get elected. So when you raise $5,000, and if you look at some of these statistics, there's the candidates that don't have a chance of winning rarely raise more than $1,000 or $2,000. So 5,000 I thought was a good sort of, dotted line. Once you raise $5,000, the city gives you $5,000. When you raise $10,000, the city gives you another $5,000. When you raise, at the moment, 13,000, whatever, 700 or something, the city gives you the remaining 3,000. So in total, the candidate who agrees to the limit would raise 13,000, etc., and the city would pitch in the other 13,000. The limit would slowly go up with the cost of living. And this is pretty much the same formula that you saw with the 60 cities. It's a little bit less expensive because a lot of those cities like New York and San Francisco and LA, they have a 4-to-1 or a 6-to-1 ratio, where the city will give you $4 or $6. I felt like in order to control spending in Santa Cruz, we didn't need to do that yet, and I definitely care about the city's budget, so I proposed a 1-to-1. Now this is a draft proposal. When it comes to City Council on June 10th, it could get changed, and for the most part, I'll be fine with that. The key for me is that I want to have limits, and I want to have a way to encourage people to obey those limits. City Council wants to raise it 5 or 10,000, or they want to do 4-to-1, or whatever. Don Lane had an interesting idea to only, when we're doing the match, only count the smaller contributions, like 100 or less. I think San Francisco does that. So there's different variations on this theme, and I'm not particularly attached. I just drafted something I thought would be simple that we could move forward on. So the cost to the city would be, and I could go through the math with you guys if you want, but someone's shaking their head. It'd be $50,000 annually, because I took an educated guess on at the most how many candidates there would be that would raise at least $5,000, and that's every 2 years. So I came up with at the most $50,000 annually, and the staff are going to check this before June 10th and give us their opinion. $50,000 is 0.26% of the city's current budget of $192 million. You will have people that are like, God, $50,000, but to me, this is the primary function of our city, is to have a healthy democracy. To me, the whole point of the city is to act as public servants to the people in Santa Cruz, and the major way we decide what that is through elections. So if we can make our election system better for the price of one maintenance worker, or if our parks are a tiny bit, have more weeds in them because we have a better democracy, to me it's worth it. That's my opinion. I think it's just worth, it's plain out, straight out worth the expense. Do I think this will pass on June 10th? I don't know. Like, we have a city council that's extremely pragmatic and focused on the city's budget. A lot of them got elected by going over the limit. On the other hand, this issue every week, every day, when you have like Leland Yee and all these other events, and you have Judge Stevens weighing in, every week this issue becomes obviously more important to the people in the state, in the United States, and in the city of Santa Cruz. So I think that if we do a good enough job in tying the dots together and making it clear to the city council that we want to be part of a national movement, then maybe this will be passed. We do have another way to get it passed, though, and this is something I'm really excited about, and I'm going to put in a lot of time and energy into this. So candidates are filing in early August. That's the filing period, right? So we all have an opportunity to get ourselves and everyone we know to sign a pledge that says, I will only support candidates who agree to the voluntary limit. It's that simple. It's not about whether they're, pro-business candidates or anti-growth candidates or, pro-police or pro-whatever or anti-whatever. It doesn't matter, which is why we should do this campaign right now, to make it clear to everyone that this is not about individual or specific politics. We don't know who's running yet. We certainly don't know who's obeying the limit yet. Right now is the time to get the people of Santa Cruz together and create a social contract that says, look, we expect, if you're running for office, that you obey limits on money in politics. It's simple, it's direct, it's what every politician should be doing, and we're a small enough town that we can make it happen. It's like if you had a bicycle advocate, you would expect them to ride their bike, right? Right? I mean, if your bicycle advocate was driving here, you'd say there's a problem. If you're gonna have a candidate for office, we should demand that they are part of a system to improve the electoral process. And if we have 100 people that take the pledge, and there's some good leaders who take it, like Rick Longinati, like Robert Singleton, like me, it might have a little bit of impact. If we have 1,000 people that take the pledge, and we have a whole bunch of leaders, like Peter Beckman, who's already taken the pledge, like Tony, who's on the SUA on campus, like the Campus Dems, who already took the pledge. Let's hear it for the Campus Dems. And the People's Democratic Club. if we have 1,000 voters and we have some leadership like that, then we will get candidates to agree to the pledge, because they are trying to win the trust of the people of Santa Cruz, and we'll make it clear to them that that's what the trust of the people of Santa Cruz means. So that's our job between now and early August, to get 1,000 people to take this pledge. And then, if the current city council doesn't vote for these changes, the next city council will, because they will be candidates who've been elected based on the will of the people of Santa Cruz to have limits in politics. So we have a couple different ways to make this happen. So we have a pledge on petitions. It's also on the computer, santacruzelections.org, with all the information, the legal definition. And I just want to say that to me it's been a real honor to work with young people about this. These interns have been great, these three, but there's been 10 or 12 interns who've worked on this over the last year. And just to see the fact, because, I think some of us have this idea, oh yeah, people don't care, whatever, but you just talk to, people who I recruited by putting flyers up on campus, and they care. They care a lot about campaign finance reform, and they're the future. So people do care, but we need to hand them at least some kind of way to express their caring. Thank you.
We have been already collecting pledges online, and Manu Koenig is here and I think is prepared to give us a little report on who's pledged so far and how many.
Hi everybody, my name is Manu, and I'm with Civinomics. Civinomics does not have a distinct political agenda, or we cannot specifically support or oppose any particular measure. However, we do want to create a system where good ideas can connect with people faster, and that more people can get involved in the process. So it's a real pleasure to work with Micah, who's got an idea he wants to connect with all of you about. And so far, we've already connected with, there's 108 people who have voted in favor of this petition, and 58 people who've taken the pledge. That's partly just because, yep. That's good. That's partly just because we didn't get the pledge portion engaged until just a week and a couple days ago. And then we've had just 16 people who voted against it, and they've also provided some good feedback and questions, some of which Mike addressed, and I'm sure would be happy to address the rest. You'll have a chance to take the pledge, vote for or against the measure, and add a comment which can either be a pro, con, amendment, or question. And so far we've also had 29 people sign up for email updates, and 7 people sign up as volunteers.
Manu, thanks again, and those of us who have been working on this really appreciate the role that Civinomics has taken in engaging more people on all sides. It's a really important role you're filling there. Thank you. Nancy mentioned at the beginning that we wanted to be sure that we gave everybody a chance here to not only clarify if you have, or get clarification if you have questions from the presentations, but also if you were really moved to just say something. We are going to invite you to do that in the coming portion of the program. We are going to ask that the statements be limited to 1 minute. And so think about what you really want to say. If you'd like to say something, it can be pro or con, it can be off the topic, whatever you want, but just limit yourself to 1 minute so that we can be fair to everyone who has a chance. And then, so we're going to do the statements first, and then we're going to take the questions that people are writing on the cards. Go.
Thank you. Yeah, the name is Gary Richard Arnold. Common Cause is one of the most powerful lobbies in the country. It's in 35 different states. In California, it's called California Forward, and it's funded by 5 foundations, some of the biggest: Packard, Hawes, the Irvine Foundation, the Commonwealth Club, and some others. And they have lobbies both in the county, the city, and the state. They work hand in hand with ICLEI, which is a front for the World Bank. So a lot of the material that's being used here is the 1%. It is the millionaires. And if you look at the co-chairman for California Forward, it's a member of McKinsey & Company, and the other is a AAA Auto Club. Also, we heard about Civinomics. Civinomics was called by Good Times California Forward 2.0. So you've got a lot of this billionaire material and massage material coming at you, pretending that it's talking against power when really the sources are power. Thank you.
When we're talking about something like this, is really what we're talking about is limitations on political speech. And the money in politics, I know that's a really hot button topic, but if you were to look at like overall spending on all these campaigns, it's like, last I heard, it's like less than what we spend on yogurt. So I want people to understand that what we're really talking about is in fact limiting political speech.
My name is Thomas Levitt. I ran for city council in 2002, and fundraising was a very huge challenge. And so I do believe that public financing is a very important step to increasing access for all candidates, that we shouldn't predetermine who's viable right up front, and make it accessible to as many people as possible to run for office.
My name is Chris Finney, and I've been working with Move to Amend in Santa Cruz County. And one of the things that we believe very strongly is that in addition to campaign finance reform and regulation, that we need to overturn the legal fiction of corporate personhood. I own 2 corporations. It's not that I hate corporations. They are not legal persons. They are not any kind of persons. Right. And this particular legal fiction has been doing an incredible amount of damage to our ability to govern our country, and our county, and our state, and our city. I also want to tell you that I worked for the McNerney campaign in 2006 when he ran for Congress successfully. We elected the first wind engineer to Congress, which I was very pleased with. But when I went out to see him get sworn into Congress, he had already started fundraising for 2008, before he was ever sworn in. And that's the sort of thing that you heard Micah talk about today, where instead of doing the job that we elected him to do, he was already starting to fundraise for his next campaign, because that's the only way you get reelected these days. And that's just not right, because that's not why we elect candidates. So this is really important. Thank you.
My name's Lainey Sherman. I'm a candidate for city council. And of course, so I'm agreeing to the campaign expenditure limits, and I support Micah's proposal. Like all of you in this room, I don't think you should be able to buy an election, particularly not here in Santa Cruz. I hope during my campaign to spend as much time as possible listening to people and as little time as possible working to raise the funds that will be necessary to run a successful campaign. I realize that accepting the expenditure limits might put me at a slight disadvantage, but one of the reasons I'm running is because I believe in taking risks to do the right thing. So, thank you.
My name's Paul Johnston, and I'm a treasurer of the People's Democratic Club. And I just want to say that the flip side of getting money out of politics is getting people into politics and us organizing. And that's, I think, to me, a big takeaway from tonight. And from the plan that was laid out here of doing a campaign to get 1,000 pledges is more than just, well, I think it's a brilliant idea, because what it does is it puts us in motion, and it gives us the challenge of beginning to get ourselves organized so that we can do the most effective job possible, getting out the vote for candidates who support this and other progressive issues in November. So I hope that everybody will be inspired. I think a few people who work well together can have a tremendous impact, and a dozen or so people who work well together can change the world. So each and every one of you, I hope we'll be working together over the next 6 months to change the world.
My name's Pete Shanks. I have a quick comment to make about the Supreme Court, which is that Supreme Courts have changed their minds. The Supreme Court used to support slavery. Fortunately, it changed its mind on that. Supreme Courts changed their minds on a lot of issues. They need to evolve. And I firmly believe, I think the majority of Americans believe, that corporations are not people and money is not speech.
We have to get our democracy back. And so we really need to act. As Nancy said at the beginning of this meeting, silence or just believing in it isn't going to do it. We have to take action.
My name is Robert Singleton. I'm also one of the co-founders of Civinomics. And first and foremost, I just want to say thank you all for coming here and participating. Civic discourse is important regardless of where you stand on the issue of campaign finance. And I'd also like to clarify that Civinomics is in no way, as previously stated by another speaker, affiliated with CalForward in any way, and I really wish we had $1 billion. But thank you.
Okay, first question is, what city or county positions currently have mandatory limits on campaign spending, and at what level of government are mandatory limits legal, federal, state, or local? Our county has mandatory limits on contributions, and the state also has limits. So currently an individual can give for a state Senate candidate $4,100 maximum. And a friend of mine was running for county supervisor in Monterey County, where they have no limits. And Bill and I were down there, Bill Monning and I, doing a fundraiser, and the same weekend this other person was doing a fundraiser. They were accepting checks for $10,000, $20,000 at a pop. They raised more money for a county supervisor position in Monterey County than we could raise for a state Senate position in California. So, the difference is huge. Now that happens to be a very progressive candidate who I'm sure is not corrupt, but the scale of the fundraising there it knocked our socks off, I'll tell you that. So the state does have mandatory limits on individual and committee contributions, and so does our Santa Cruz County, but plenty of counties don't, and I don't believe any of the cities in Santa Cruz County have any required limits. How closely have city council candidates in recent years followed the voluntary limits? There were some gaps in the information that we gathered, but as Micah mentioned, the last limit in 2012 was about $27,000, and it has been adjusted for population and inflation. So the 2010 election was a little less than that, and 2008 was a little less than that. In 2008, there were candidates that spent over $40,000. Same thing in 2010 and 2012. So there is an increasing range, and we did notice one trend that you might have seen in some of the graphs, which is that in the presidential years, there are more voters and the dollar per vote goes down, but the spending still is pretty high. But it's all going up over, accounting for a difference in the presidential election years. The trend is upward. I'm not sure I understand this question. I'd like to see a sociogram. I don't know what that is. This does also mention Lawrence Lessig, who is a major national and international proponent of open source software. He recently had a column in the New York Times in which he said that the politics of campaign finance reform seem really discouraging right now. And he tried to poke into that and see what exactly it was about that made it seem impossible to ever get it. And he said that polls consistently show that the people of the United States want to limit the money in politics, but they also show that people don't have much hope for it. And why is that? Because they perceive that the sitting legislatures, the Congress and the state legislatures, aren't going to do anything that really interferes with their own interests of getting reelected. And so what Lessig says, and this is what I'm hoping to convey, and what today's forum theme is really, is that it's got to come from the people. It's got to start with the demand of the people, otherwise those bodies are not going to act. And it was, to me, gratifying to see. Lawrence Lessig is sometimes controversial, but he was on the right side of this one as far as I'm concerned. Is there anything currently in place to prevent the Koch brothers from spending unlimited money to influence Santa Cruz elections if they wanted to do that? No. Well, other than candidates accepting limits. Right.
Yeah, I mean, there are mandatory county limits, and as of yet, all the city council candidates, even if they haven't agreed to the ordinance, they've agreed to the individual limits. But because they're not agreeing to the ordinance, we don't know which candidate at some point will take that money. In other words, there's a polite culture, and I want to say that, I want to really appreciate it, but it could change at any minute. So literally, like, the two candidates that didn't accept the limit in the last election, if they would have received a $50,000 check, they would have had to decide whether to cash it or not. We're really that close to having a problem.
is the PDC or MICA considering a quarter-cent city tax or tax on city businesses to fund elections? I think what Micah said was no, that he is proposing that this small amount of money come from the budget. It's a 0.2%, so 2/thousandths of the total city budget, and I don't think, and I tend to agree with Micah that it would not require a new tax to fund it. Is making it mandatory going to lose votes? Is that necessary in order to be effective? Micah, you want to address that?
Yeah, I think the idea, the part of the proposal about making the individual limits mandatory, I think will probably be the easiest to pass because all the seated council members agreed to these limits out of their respect for, democracy. So I actually think that'll be the easiest part to pass. I think the public financing piece with the overall limits will be more difficult because in order for them to vote for it, they'll have to have a different vision for the future than the one they had when they ran for office. And I think that's possible because when they ran for office, they knew other people weren't going to accept the limits either. So I think it's possible for a member of the city council or someone like Obama or whoever to say, yeah, I was part of that system and it wasn't great and now I want to change it. But the mandatory limits I think will be easier. That in itself would be a good step forward because it would solve the potential problem of the Koch brothers writing a $50,000 check. So, as a pragmatic political person, I'm all about incremental change. So we'll get something through on June 10th, and we'll get 1,000 people, then we'll get a council agrees to it, and we'll get this thing passed sometime in the next few years.
Next question, given the institutional advantages enjoyed by incumbents, why not apply the limit only to incumbents? I'd like to establish a baseline. Let me comment first, and then it is interesting. One of the things that we looked at, we didn't have time to present data on it with the campaign finance research that we did, was we looked at when do incumbents win or lose, and does the amount of money they raise have an effect on that? And it was interesting that in the 2004 city elections, 2 incumbents who also were among the top fundraisers in that election were turned out of office, and 2 challengers who had not been incumbents, and a female candidate who was the top vote getter beat those. So incumbency doesn't always mean you get reelected in Santa Cruz. It certainly, though, in general conveys an advantage because you're better known. So that's an interesting idea. Micah, do you want to reply to the particular?
Yes, let's keep in mind that incumbents have a much easier time raising money. So without limits, then incumbents will simply raise more money. It's
No,
far.
apply only.
Apply-
I'm not giving you a baseline.
Apply only to the incumbents.
Only the incumbents, and the challengers, they've maybe made 1X or 2X or whatever, but if you only apply to incumbents, because as you lower that limit,
Right.
the incumbent's advantage gets more. If we got down to 0, you have, the Sentinel and all these, and so that establishes the baseline.
Yeah.
And it's self-limiting.
Yeah, well, I mean, there could be 2 different limits, one for incumbents, one for newcomers. I mean, that's an interesting proposal. Like I said, this is a draft proposal. I think that not having limits definitely helps incumbents because they raise more money. But that's true. We could have, you could have 20% less for incumbents or 30% less or whatever. A lot of the candidates that have gone, have gone way over the limit in the 40,000 ranges. Some of them have been incumbents and some haven't. In fact, there was one candidate who went over the first time, and then when he ran the second time, he went over the same amount. And and when he was asked why, he was asked why he went over the limit. He said, "Well, I needed to because I wasn't an incumbent." So the reporter, who'd done some careful research, said, "Why'd you go over the second time?" And he said, "I want to do another mailer." So yeah, I think that it is totally true that incumbency is an advantage, and I'm not sure it should be, but having limits on money, I think, would generally help it in the abstract, although it is understandable you have 2 different limits.
Okay. Next question. This is actually a question I was going to ask. Please explain how or why you view unions and corporations the same when considering campaign finance reform. And the reason I was going to ask this question is because when you see the actual amounts that are spent by corporations and unions spend this much. This is nationwide. Corporations spend this much. It's dramatically, I can't reach quite up there. It's dramatically different. So to me, the idea of making them equivalent is not valid.
I don't view unions and businesses as corporations the same. I just mentioned them both because in Santa Cruz, those are the 2 groups that tend to do independent expenditures. In fact, I'm quite thankful to the unions that they do independent expenditures, and it's not only the business community that does it, because it really helps level the playing field to some degree. And it's individual workers who are wanting to affect politics. So, in the abstract, I have to say I'd rather we didn't have independent expenditures, but given that the businesses and the corporations have them, I'm appreciative that the unions have a countervailing role to play in that. Good.
All right, that was all the questions that I could read.
One thing is I really want to appreciate the move to amend people. I wonder if Chris left, but David's still here. I mean, these guys worked really hard for months to try to also make Santa Cruz County leader in moving to amend the Constitution in a way that makes sense to most of us. And they educated a lot of people. They got thousands of signatures. So I think one of them's still here. They all look tired. But thank you, David. Part of what inspired me to work on this, like a lot of people probably, was the scandal with Leland Yee. And I just want to say one thing about that. To win the office of Secretary of State in California, it takes $3 to $5 million during the last decade or two. And this, ironically, is the office of the person who oversees the elections, right? So there's been a lot of talk in the newspapers about, well, how could this guy be so corrupt? But and I am not happy that he's so corrupt. However, let's keep in mind that he wasn't taking money for himself. He was taking money for his election campaign. So we've created a system that puts an incredible amount of pressure on candidates to raise incredible amounts of money. I'm surprised that more of them aren't corrupt, or maybe more of them are corrupt and we just don't know it. We have a bad system that's not all his fault. This is like it's a really terrible thing. So another thing I hope people will think about is there's a candidate running for Secretary of State who comes from Common Cause, which by the way is not the same as California Forward. And he comes from this background. He's an activist. He totally understands the job of Secretary of State. His name is Derek Pressman. I've endorsed him. I hope you guys will think about supporting him.
I hope you got a lot out of this today. Before you go, be sure to check the tables at the back if you want to sign the pledge if you haven't already. And I do want to thank a few people. Besides our sponsor today, the People's Democratic Club of Santa Cruz, a great progressive democratic organization, there were some volunteers who did some incredible work, and I don't have all their names right here, but Paul Gratz, if he's still here, did a major job to let's thank our student interns again for their great research. Matilda Rand is here. I lost her. Filming this. This will be on community television coming soon. And Nancy Abbey, thank you again for the introduction today.
Let's have one more thank you. Bruce Van Allen, former mayor, is someone who stayed true to his values for many, many years and continues to inspire all of us. So thank you.